welcome to our September Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition webinar. Today we're going to be talking about something really important for prison and jail volunteers, chaplains, and that has to do with boundaries. It's professional ethics and boundaries for ministry with the incarcerated. And our presenter today is Father Stan Bosch, who has extensive experience in this. He is a member of the Missionary Servants of the Most Holy Trinity, and they're a religious community who work primarily with the poor and the abandoned. And he's worked in Los Angeles with gang-involved youth and adults for more than 30 years. He also served several years in Mexico and for many years as pastor of Our Lady of Victory and Sacred Heart churches in Compton. He holds a doctoral degree in psychology with an emphasis on marriage and family therapy. And that's from the California Graduate Institute of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He's also a psychotherapist. He's director of mental health personnel development for gang intervention and staff workers with Soledad Enrichment Action, SEA, and the City of Los Angeles's Gang Reduction and Youth Development Project. He also maintains a therapeutic practice in psychotherapy in South LA, specializing in psychodynamic group and individual psychotherapy, treating early trauma, abuse, depression, addiction, and gang-related issues. He's bilingual in English and Spanish. And recently he was named pastor of St. Raphael's Church in South LA. So we're delighted to have him with us. And this is going to be a longer webinar than usual. It's going to be 90 minutes rather than 60 minutes because there's a lot of material to cover and it's really important that we cover it. We'll also be presenting this webinar tomorrow in Spanish at the same time tomorrow at 10 a.m. California time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. But before Father Stan joins us, let's take a moment and just kind of prepare ourselves spiritually to enter into this conversation. And so I invite you to close your eyes and we offer ourselves to you, Lord, today. And we thank you for giving us this opportunity to serve you and your people, especially those who are most abandoned and suffering. We ask you, Lord, for the wisdom to continue to challenge ourselves as to why we're doing this work, in order that we might be agents of liberation for those who we encounter. We ask you to bless all those who we encounter in our work, the victims of crime, their families, and those who work in the prison system as well. We ask you all of this in confidence as we pray in the power of Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So welcome, Father Stan.
Thank you, Father George, and I'm honored to be with you. And to all of you all around the country, you can see this, Father George?
Yes, that's fine. Oh, and before you continue, as people are watching, if you have comments or questions, be sure to write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and then I will monitor those and let Father Stan know what the questions or comments are during the presentation.
Thank you. I give a welcome to you all, although I'm the one that feels welcomed by the Prison Coalition and our team. I welcome members, perhaps of my own community that may be with us. People from Soledad Enrichment Action, who I serve with. Our HR director, Human Resources Director, Survey, I think, is going to join us. And people from my own parish, our faith formators and facilitators, and all of you around the country that are doing such depth and transformational service to our people. This picture here is a picture of many of our workers, fellows that have been longtime felons in prison and were released because they had some sort of a conversion and a enlightened experience. 3 of those men there are dead now, have been killed in the line of our work. And I call them, as Carl Jung would say, our wounded healers. And one of my assumptions is that we all who are called to serve in extreme kind of service and ministries and mission, we really, I think we're drawn to this work because of our own wounds, because of our own unfinished early childhood and infancy needs that we come to have healed in the process. So welcome to you all. As I continue Father George's moment of stillness and quiet, would you just be still for a moment? Our minds just race us into oblivion at times. The Buddhists call the mind the ego, and our egos want to control so much, and yet being present in this eternal now, being aware of our breath, which is ruach, the very life of Jesus inside of us, that no medical doctor, no scientist can tell us where breath comes from, because we are absolute life force and miracle. So Paul calls us the temples of the Spirit, and that as we breathe together the breath of Pentecost, we become the very body of Jesus. And Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, says that the most important part of the body is the part that is the most fragile and weak. So what I add to Father George's prayer to say thank you for this call to serve those that are in desperate and difficult situations, that you've allowed us to have the desire to simply accompany without having the answer to the pain, without giving advice. Your transformative presence through us and through those that we serve, I believe, co-creates a world of healing and justice and peace. So our wounded healers, I present you as of myself. Welcome to our mission. You ever feel like that? Anybody have any comments? This presentation I originally created, and then I present regularly to our intervention workers and case managers and those that serve with us as volunteers in Soledad Enrichment Action. And I asked the question, why would you do that? Why would you put your head in the lion's mouth? And yet many of us have to admit that that's what we're doing. When you go into a lockdown situation on the street in our ministries, that the lions are out there because they're so filled with pain that gets projected out. But have you ever felt like that? Would you just be in touch with it for a moment? Anybody wants to make a comment? Or have you ever felt like this? I ask, what do you see there? Anybody have any comments? Father George, do you see in the chat?
Yes. One person noted that violence in our communities feels so overwhelming.
Yeah. And that I don't know about you, but I feel like this a lot. And I asked the cow, what are you doing? What are you looking for? What's going on there? And then what about this guy or this girl in the back? I wonder what he or she's thinking. Can you see my pointer, Father George?
Yes.
You ever feel like that? I do quite often, because I don't have the answer to all of the crazy darkness that I encounter in a day. I live in a very difficult area of South LA in Los Angeles, California. And our young guys are just out of control because they don't know what to do with their pain. We're going to talk a lot about that today and how we bridle that. So there's a story about a little girl who comes home from school late one day, and the mother was livid. She said, "Why didn't you come right home? Where have you been?" The little girl said, "I couldn't come home, Mommy." She said, "Why not? Your daddy's been waiting for dinner." She said, "I couldn't come back because I encountered my little girlfriend on the street, and her doll broke to pieces out of her arms." And the mother said, "I told you to come right home. You couldn't put that doll back together for that girl." And the little girl said, "I know, Mommy, I couldn't put the doll back together, but I sat down on the curb with her and I helped her to cry." I don't know about you, but I believe we can't put the doll back together. The broken pieces are out there, and I believe they're in here. And to think that I have the power, even in the name of Jesus, to put the broken pieces back together. Well, I believe in that accompanying and simply crying with that little girl. There's the relational power. I believe that's the power of Jesus inside of us. That's what real justice means, as we're going to talk about in a moment. It's about healing relationships, where most of you, I think all of you, I would project, live in a system that is unjust. It's a punitive system. It's a system of payback. It's not about restoration, but retaliation. That you got me, I'm going to get you. I think those words of President Bush during 9/11, of which we just remembered on Monday, that we're going to bring him to justice. I remember that so clearly in my heart going, what? You're going to bring them to justice? No, you're going to bring them to retaliation. But that's what I assume that all of us are confronting all day long in our service, is people that have grown up in a situation where you get me, I'm going to get you, and we continue the payback. And yet we come from a place of, no, I just want to be with you in your tears. I'm not going to make it all, bring it all back together again, but in the name of the Lord Jesus, that we can look for healing together. So the other story is about the monkey who was up on the limb of the tree, and he swooped down and he grabbed a whole paw full of fish and put it on the limb with him. A man walked by saying, "What are you doing, you crazy monkey?" And the monkey looked down and he said, "Well, I'm attempting to save these fish from drowning." A lot of people that I meet and people that come into our mission and say, I believe they have what's called a rescue fantasy, that I'm going to make it all better for you, that I think I know what you need. And here I am with you it becomes a manipulation rather than a ministry and a service of presence. If I assume that I know what another person needs, then I really need to be careful. Because if I don't have the disposition that I'm here to learn from you, I simply want to listen, then we're grabbing fish and we're attempting to save them. So the iron rule, I believe this is important for us. It comes from community organizing. The iron rule is never do for others what they can do for themselves. This is a relationship I believe that we all share together. Me and Gang Intervention, visiting juvenile hall and the camps and city jail. It's about empowering versus helping. We have one sister that worked with us for many years, a Benedictine sister, Elisa. And when our young people would come to serve with us, or interns or new case managers, and say, "I just want to help people," she said, "That's a bunch of crap. We're not here to help anyone, because that assumes that I have something that I'm going to give you. And the relationship can be based on manipulation rather than mutual learning and experiencing of healing together." So I do believe that the heart of our work is really about empowering by listening, by caring. I shared with you all in another taping that Alice Miller, she was the first in the 1980s and 90s to write about infancy and childhood sexual abuse. She wrote a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, and I really recommend it to you. It's on PDF, and we can send it to you if you like later. The Drama of the Gifted Child. She says in that book, this very beautiful and very short saying, that emotional healing happens in the life of a person who's been abused if they have a sympathetic witness to their pain. And I impose that on our workers. Isn't that our mission declaration? To become a sympathetic witness to the pain of another. Again, I don't have the answer to your pain. I have my own pain. But if I think I'm going to get you through yours by telling you about mine, it really isn't appropriate. It's really breaking all kinds of boundaries and ethical rules, because if I think I'm going to tell you what to do, in my world as an MFT doctor's level therapist, if I tell another person what to do, I can be sued and I can lose my license. An example of that is that if I'm listening to somebody that has nutrition issues or an eating disorder, which is not my scope of competence, if I start to recommend a nutrition outline or a diet, they could sue me and I could lose my license because it's out of my scope of work. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I wonder, what is your role in what you do every day? How do you see yourself? I wonder if these images can be challenging for all of us. Building bridges between broken hearts is a powerful metaphor. So what are ethics? And I ask our workers, so it takes time. Does anybody want to put out there how you would define ethics in the chat? Father George, do you see anything? Just take a moment to write something down. What are ethics? Perhaps I'll continue, George.
Yeah, nobody's responded yet, but please be sure to type in your response when you get a chance.
Ethics are important because unlike intelligence, athleticism, charisma, or any other natural attribute, ethics are a choice. They're a choice that we make to follow certain principles. While we remain 95 to 90% unconscious. Do you know the psyche, which is the totality of the human person? The very word psyche means soul in Greek. So we're talking about soul work here. 98% of my soul is unconscious. How to wake up, how to be fully alive and present in this moment if I'm unconscious. Here's the reason why we need ethics and ethical principles. Can you tell us what that is? George, Courtney, Karen, Kara, what do you see there? Pardon, George?
It's an iceberg. And also, but before you go on, we have a couple of comments about ethics.
Okay.
One is Francisco wrote, it's related to moral choices. And then Oscar wrote, ethics is a moral standard that society has agreed to follow.
And there's different kind of ethics, aren't there? Yeah. There's the ethic of the street, where the rule is you gotta do payback. The ethic on the street is that you gotta do a mission. And when I first started this work, I learned that's not the mission of Jesus for healing, but it's to go and you gotta take life for life, so you can be a part of this world. So there's different kinds of ethics out there that haven't you noticed that even the Supreme Court doesn't have any moral ethics, that our Senate and our Capitol, the people that represent us, have no ethical principles for insider trading. I mean, these are big deals these days, and they're big deals all days. So the iceberg. There's a lot of ways to imagine this iceberg. When I was in North Carolina a couple of years ago with law enforcement and some social workers, when I asked, what do you see there? One woman said, I see sinuses here going up the center. Another man said, and I didn't know this because I didn't learn it in school, but he said, do you know that an iceberg is fresh water in salt water? And that's why it crystallizes. I never knew that. But isn't it interesting to look at this piece on the top, on the surface? That's what we can see. In the totality of the iceberg includes this huge part of which that surface piece is floating. It was Sigmund Freud that first used this image as the image of the soul, or the image of the psyche. This is what we allow the world to see, but this is really what's going on. So I find for the work that I participate in as pastor and as director of mental health and therapist, that this is the piece that has so much to say about this up here. This is a wonderful place of exploration for us with others in ministry, but for ourselves also. And so the whole principle of this is that this underside emerges in dreams and in projections and in all of the unconscious emotional reactivity that emerges out of me. Father George, why is something a problem for you and it's not for me? Why would you react to something and I wouldn't, emotionally or angrily? Because of our histories, because of our historical histories, intergenerational patterns and traumas, our developmental traumas, what we've experienced all through our life, it gets stuffed inside. Literally, we call it repression in clinical language. It gets repressed into the erased memory of the cells of our bodies. Everything that's ever happened to us, even in the fetus of our mother's womb, to listen to dad beat mother, or to listen to gunshots or sirens. It becomes a part of a little one's psyche, although they don't have the brain development to be able to process that. It's in there somehow or another. So all the cumulative kinds of traumas that we're going to talk about also through this presentation on ethics is inside, and it emerges. And it's going to happen with us also. Here's another image. This is the conscious, our thoughts, our perceptions, what we present to the world. But at the underneath are our memories and stored knowledge. on the unconscious level, our fears, our stored fears and phobias, feelings, thoughts, urges, memories, all those unacceptable parts of ourself, which Carl Jung, who broke with Sigmund Freud early on, would call the shadow. The shadow side of our being isn't a negative thing. It's the part which is hidden, a part that has so much to teach us. And I believe that our ministries and what we share together is that this ministry that we're called to awakens all of those unawakened parts of us at times. We're going to have feelings and thoughts and projections. I pray that all of us, as we're going to talk about in a while, have somebody we could talk to about the inner stirrings of our being, that somebody would know us on that inner level. And many of us would say the whole goal of life, the goal of growth in the soul, is to bring this piece to another level of awakening. It was Meister Eckhart in the 13th century that said that all spirituality is about waking up. Waking up from all of this place that we're asleep. It's in there all day long, all night long. And yet the invitation simply to listen to others and to ourselves. Do we take time to listen? I say most people that I meet are not really reflective. And I hear so many conversations that just, as our young people would say, it's just talking smack. It's just superficial, not really having to do with anything important. And yet what we're doing is transformative. It's about life and death all day long, right? So ethics is, as Frank said, they're moral principles that govern a person's behavior for the conducting of an activity. We need those principles if the 98% of my being is unconscious. I need principles to participate in to guide my behavior, because I'm going to react out of the unconscious. I do all the time anyway. And yet I take the pause between my perceptions and my emotions so I can make a more appropriate decision on how I'm going to act. In my work, and in my world, many of our staff struggle with affect regulation. They don't know what they feel. There's unclear personal boundaries and are not necessarily guided by solid ethical principles. And so in our cultures that I serve, it's so common to hear another, do you feel me? Do you feel me? Do you feel me? To in other words, to say, do you understand me? But what I've recognized is that so many people don't know what they feel. They don't know what's going on. And many of us will define emotion as energy in motion. We look for affect, we look for movement that I'm going to talk about in a while. We all have masks, right? The mask I have on right now, or the personality that I'm revealing to you, is very different than if I go to happy hour tonight with my friends, or very different too than in my places to celebrate in liturgy or in the sacraments. The difference between the personalities that I allow to emerge, the persona, as Jung would call it, or the mask, is that I'm aware of those different roles. But so many people that have developmental and historical trauma in the erased memory of the cells of their bodies, they're not aware of those different personalities, and that it emerges in inadvertent and unconscious ways. It used to be called personality disorder, right? Or now we call it the dissociative identity disorder, that we have different kinds of dissociations that are not conscious, and they could become destructive or violent. Am I going too fast, Father George?
No, it's fine. I do want to remind people, if you have comments or questions, be sure to type them in the chat as we're going on.
Here's some expectations from Human Resources and Soledad and Rhythm and Action, of which I serve. And I think Savea, who's our director, is probably on this right now. Would you just mention, Savea, if you are? These are just a couple of pieces. We have a whole list of things, but some things that I think we might have in common in our work. Do we have minimal expectations of ourselves in ministry? Some of ours are accountability and our integrity, honesty in our word. My question would be, who are you accountable to? Who kind of has your back, but also can challenge you in the ministry? Because what I see out here is so many of our chaplains, especially our state chaplains in their state penitentiaries, that are isolated from one another. They're hired by the institution. So they're employees of the penal system. They have the approbation or the go-ahead from the bishop, but they really have no one that they're really talking to or that's holding them accountable. So we have extreme kinds of preachings at people, screaming and yelling in the name of Jesus. And we have some people that are just kind of lost because they don't have a connection with other people to challenge them, to have very valuable and healthy trainings to be able to deal with our own emotions. And we have people in our work in SEA and gang intervention that they'll just go for the day and not be accountable to the work. And palabra is everything here, our word, my word, and yet it's so easy to make up, to be false, to lie. Professional conduct and boundaries, that's what we explore all the time in SEA work. It even has to do with our dress. What do we dress like? I very intentionally don't wear a collar because I don't really need to, because I'm known here. There's some 5 basic ethical principles for therapists here in California, but I think they apply to us also. And I think there's a lot more than these 5, but here's just a couple that I'd like to share with you. One is beneficence. This is the #1 principle of medical people and therapists. And I believe it needs to be ours also, to do good. So even before I open my mouth to make a comment when I'm listening to somebody, I'm asking myself, is this going to be helpful? If I haven't heard, for example, in therapy, that a young person has mentioned their father, that for me, all of a sudden, because I'm curious, say, well, tell me about your dad. That might be very disruptive to the inner life of another person because they can't talk about it yet. So I wait until a person can talk, and I don't push people to share with me, but I wait to share, to listen to what they want to share, because I do believe that every word expresses meaning in their lives. So I'm very conscious, am I doing good here? And the other is no malfeasance, not to do harm. That's why you and I know this happens all over the United States, that if we go to a medical doctor and it's out of their scope of work, they refer us, right? Like I refer you to a dermatologist or to someone that knows about bones, that they know their scope of work. And yet in our ministry with our volunteers and many of our chaplains, I don't believe they're clear about their scope of work, and that we can do harm if we're not clear. And I'll share with you some insights about that in a little while. Autonomy, to respect an individual's right to make their own decisions. This might seem obvious, but what's difficult for me is if I have somebody, a young person or an older person, that's revealing suicidal ideation. For example, the fantasy to kill themselves. And I'm dealing with them in a certain context, like in lockup or in therapy, that I can't control what they do on the outside. And it would be unethical to attempt to rescue them, to go after them. This is really harsh, I imagine, for many of you, because I think we want to make it all better for people in the name of ministry, in the name of the healing touch of Jesus. But an ethical principle is that we allow people the right to make their own decisions. So I have a number of girls that, well, they call themselves cutters out here, right? That idea of cutting myself. And what we've learned is that it's not necessarily about suicide. It's about wanting to feel something. And I want to feel. I have a pact with 2 young women that, as I said, even in the evenings, if you have this desire to cut or this compulsion to cut, give me a call. I'll never tell you what to do. I just will ask you how you're feeling. For months on end, when these women have called me, they didn't cut. And they share with me later, it's because you gave us our own capacity to make our decision, but you were there to listen and to allow us to express what we're feeling on the inside. Justice, to treat people fairly. But Walter Burkhardt, who's a Jesuit, Father George, right? He's a specialist in homily and in scripture. And he defines justice as about healing relationships. And you live in a system that isn't just. It's about retribution. So Burkhardt calls it fidelity to the demands of another, demands for healing. Fidelity, to follow through and to keep your promises. I had a young therapist that was doing her hours, 3,000 hours to be licensed under my supervision. She just came in the first couple of weeks, she started to say, you know, my clients are starting to heal. I'm going, uh-oh, there's some grandiosity going on here probably. And I said, well, what do you tell them? She said, well, one thing I tell them, I'll always be here for them. And my first reaction was, why would you lie to them? I said, well, I'm not lying. I'll always be here. So I followed it up. How many days a week are you? She said 2. How many hours in those 2 days? 4. And so you're always going to be there? My assumption is that those that are incarcerated and those that are gang involved and those that have dealt with extreme violence, they can see right through us. They can see the crap if we're not really true to people. So to keep our promises, you know, I'll be here in the institution on Friday. If I'm not here, it means that something happened. I mean, I'm very clear to not make promises that I know that I can't keep. So here's the thing, boundaries. Everybody, I think, George, will have access to this PowerPoint, right, later? Yes. So I'm going to go relatively quickly because there's so much. Boundaries, where I begin and you leave off. Boundaries with children, youth, adults are all for the protection of all, including ourselves. Such boundaries do not preclude joyful, healthy, appropriate relationships with those that we serve. The boundaries that I cannot see as easily are those I believe that we need to learn to navigate more effectively. And it really is through dialogue. Physical, touch and space, boundaries in emotion, feelings, needs, desires. What are my needs in this work? How am I feeling when I get an applause after a homily? Is it about me? What are my desires? My hopes for myself and for others? Behavioral and shared activities. If boundaries aren't clear, then it really confuses the relationship and it contaminates it. How about the digital, phone and email, other kinds of communication? Are there boundaries in your world? The violation of boundaries. A definition of a boundary is an action by someone who is a boundary violation, an action by someone who is trusted. By its very nature, crosses over into the physical, the emotional, the behavioral boundaries of another person. Boundary violations contradict safe environmental policies. Most people with boundary issues are more likely to have been violated on their own boundaries. Vulnerable youth. This is a big deal that I'm going to talk about in a minute, even about touch. That if I think I'm going to hug somebody and care for them and demonstrate compassion and care, I don't know if that person was abused by their father or mother or someone else when they were little. I don't know what their reaction is going to be, what their internal response will be to my need to hug you or to touch you. And our vulnerable people really have boundary issues. How about this? Too something, too close, too long, too much, too late, too private, too personal. That's a good indication on an affective level. It could be physical, touching too much in ways that most adults would not touch a child or another adult. Patting a thigh, a knee, a leg, full frontal hugs, showing affection when alone with another, a minor or an older person. Sister Elisa from my work tells the story that she was trying to bring a group of fellows in that were very gang involved back into the school for an afternoon program. And one of the fellows that was probably the leader wouldn't get out of the car, so she touched his shoulder. He jumped out of the car and he almost put her on the ground. She said she learned so much from that experience. Afterwards, when she was processing with him, she learned from them that he had been violated by his mother when he was little, touched sexually. And that touch of Sister Lisa, although a Catholic sister, touching his shoulder triggered all sorts of things on his inside. And he was ready to kill her. I mean, we don't know the pain that another's carrying in their life. Behavioral, becoming excessively involved in the activities of daily living with another person. I put child or adolescent, but also adults. Do we play out of that rescue fantasy that I'm going to take you home with me, or I'm going to meet you, when you get out? And we have really strict understandings here in Catholic ministry in California and in Los Angeles Archdiocese. You don't continue the relationship. And I wonder what that's about anyway. Is it my need to have you in my life? What I find, if I'm really holding professional boundaries and really caring in a really honest way, that I'm going to look to help another to be capacitated or to be empowered. Who else could you talk to like this? Who else maybe in your world might you be able to trust like you've come to trust me? And so we're empowering others to expand the relationship, not based on my own neediness, but on how another person can become more free. This is huge. And until I learned this, boy, oh boy, I probably violated a lot of boundaries myself, inadvertently and unintentionally. There's a difference between intention and perception. My intentions as a minister may be good, but what matters most is how my behaviors are perceived. I never know what filters another person has. Like that, even the touch on the shoulder or a full frontal hug. I don't know. We need to remind ourselves that the relationships we enter in our roles have an inherited power differential. And I'd say those of us that are volunteers or full-fledged chaplains, that there's a power differential, meaning that I have resources that another might not have. I have a sense of myself and safety in my world, perhaps, that another doesn't have. I have my own self-worth and understanding as a disciple and later apostle of Jesus that another might not have. So the power differential is really important in our professional relationships. We are responsible for maintaining healthy boundaries in these relationships, being aware and taking care. Intentions and perceptions. Intentions are always perceived or filtered by the receptors or the receivers' freedom of choice. Perception of me. I'm a white older male. The other day I was down on Florence and Hoover at a taco station. This huge man comes running up to me, getting, "Get the F out of here." And I said, whoa, okay, I'm gone, because I don't need my ego to be inflated by getting into a fight. But I said, what happened? He said, I hate all white people. Well, I left. I don't know the perception of another person. When I first came here to this neighborhood, some of the little guys saying, you look just like Trump. I said, no, I don't want to look like Trump. But people have perceptions of us, and we don't know what they are until we check them out. And that's going to inherently color the perception, even though my intention, no, I have a right to be here. This is my neighborhood. I can get a taco. No, I don't need to get killed either. The intentions are filtered by the receiver's relationship with me, their expectations of me, their history of trauma. This is huge. Their experience of boundaries and touch. And I don't know what they are. So I want to be careful. Their lives are sacred space. They're a current emotional state. I'm not really afraid on our street because I know what to do when gunshots happen. And I know what to do when I'm coming across somebody that's high on crystal meth. I'll stay away from them. And I know that there's no capacity for dialogue or for me to even attempt to walk by. Their life situation, being incarcerated, their interests and needs at the moment. Oh, I just have a need to be hugged. And then I give the hug and I'm the perpetrator. We have to be aware, and so on. Filtered intentions lead to perceptions. which may or not correspond to your intentions, but nevertheless constitute the receiver's experience. There are so many limitations in the professional world, in therapy and in the medical field, because of lawsuits. I'm going to share that with you a little bit as mandated reporters and what that looks like. So here's my space and here's your space. And there's the boundary. What is it? I believe that this is a great graphic for married and couples, that there's two individual people that are whole, supposedly, and they share life, but they still maintain their individuality. Sometimes it gets enmeshed. You're going to meet my needs, or how many young people say, I'll never love again, or I'm going to kill myself if she breaks up with me. So I like this image of a ball field. When somebody's playing soccer, there's so much room and area to be creative and to play the sport. If the ball goes out of bounds, we don't start screaming and crying, oh my God, the ball went up. We bring the ball back in bounds and we continue. If there's been a perception of a violation of any kind of appropriate boundary, then let's talk about it. Let's bring it back. I want to change my behavior. What do you need? So here's some do's and don'ts. I was really reluctant to put this, but the coalition team said, no, let's put it out there. So, because it might be very helpful. We do know your job description, your scope of work. Do you have a scope of work? Do you have a job description? I think it's really important in your diocese and in your institutions that it be clear what is your scope, because we all can be vulnerable to the rescue fantasy, as I mentioned before, that I want to help everyone. And then I get burnt out, or unreasonable expectations because I can't meet everybody's need. If you're in an institution of 1,000 people, how are you going to be able to meet their needs? What is your clear scope? So I'm going to share with you mine. Know your role, your scope of competency. Here's how they're different. So I'm a doctor level marriage and family therapist. I have a scope of work, and it's very clear. My scope of work is to be able to assess emotional pain, to assess any kind of psychological disorder. I can assess, I can diagnose, and I can treat. Here's my scope of competency. My scope of competency is developmental trauma. And that's where I did my postgraduate work. That's where I'm getting all my CEUs, or my continuing education credits. Those of us that are in careers like this or in licensed things, we have to have 36 hours of coursework every 2 years just to maintain our license. So I take most of my work on trauma because that's what I'm exposed to the most. So in my scope of work, I can assess, I can diagnose, and I can treat. And I don't assess. I don't do psychological evaluations because it's not my competency, because I didn't continue to grow in that area to learn more. And there's certain kinds of tests, like the Rorschach test, that has a lot of mathematics in it. And I'm not good at math. So it's really interesting. I stay within my scope. What is yours? And who do you talk about? Who do you talk with about your scope of work? And where the boundaries can, in a sense, become very unclear in the day-to-day of your work. We conduct ourselves in a professional manner. Maybe this seems to be obvious, but how do you dress? We have so many fellows that we professionalize this since the late 1990s, early 2000s, but they continue to dress in gang dress. And it's not so much colors anymore, like red and blue on our streets, but they are baggy pants or baggy shorts. And we want to challenge that. How about our speech? I am not a gang member, and yet I've lived around gangs for 35 years. So I don't call people homie, what's up, homie? I don't change my accent. I'm very clear that I can be me. And what I found, there's a couple of things that really make a difference. I believe that the greatest skill that we need for the work that I do in intervention is to care. and that people can notice right away if I care or not, that I'm other focused. I'm not just talking about me. I'm not trying to identify with you on the street, but rather I just want to come to know you and who you are and our actions. Can we be challenged by our actions, our speech, and our dress by anyone? Who is that in your world? If personal problems are interfering with our professional performance, we need to get help. We need to talk to somebody professional, especially a supervisor. And yet again, I ask, who is your supervisor? As a pastor and a Catholic priest, I don't have a supervisor. I think some of them might be on this right now. I have my general counsel that are supposed to hold me accountable, but they're not with me every day. And so they trust that I'm going to be held accountable and that I'm going to come to them and talk to them about the sorts of things that are interfering with my being pastor. Here's a piece. Now, this is about California, but I think it has to apply to all of us, that issues of confidentiality and mission. And I would challenge you to look at what are the mandating reporting laws in your state or in your counties. Because my assumption is that we're all mandated reporters. And I'm going to tell you what that is. For us, it concerns a loss of LTO if I report. In the world out here, in the gang world and the intervention world, that's called license to operate. It's not a driver's license. It's rather the acceptance by the local community that I can operate in that area. We have certain fellows that can't serve in certain gang areas because those gangs are enemies to where they grew up. So they have a license to operate. In other words, we call it juice. They have power in certain areas. I have pretty much a license to operate in most of the places that we serve because I've been here for so long, in Compton and East LA and South LA. But there are places like right down the street that I can't even go to buy a taco, right? How the process works. For the purpose of protecting children is what this is about. When we hear about abuse of children, we're mandated reporters. The process is simple in California. There's a 1-800 number, for the protection of children. And the person on the other side, it's usually a social worker, guides the conversation and asks about the details. And their work is to discern whether they're going to call DCFS, which is the Department of Child Services and Family Services, or they're going to call the police. And many times they won't take any action because they don't believe there's enough evidence. But it's about protecting children and for healing the family systems. I've had so many conversations with supervisors of social workers in our different spas, it's called out here, or different areas. And they assure me, they said, we attempt to drill into our social workers that they're not about sending parents or anyone else to jail. We're looking for healing of the system. We don't want to violate people. And yet with our intervention workers, we have a difficult time telling them this is not about snitching, which you can lose your license on the street, but it is about reporting. So we need to talk about it when it happens. Here's limits to confidentiality. I go through it, and the fellows and girls in my group therapies, they know it by heart. They do it pretty quickly, but it goes like this. It's about child abuse. I have to report. It can be sexual, under the age of 18, or a 14-year-old with someone under 14. Why is it 14? It's because of the law. It's because of lawsuits. And I could give you a lot of examples about that, but if anybody's interested later. It's emotional abuse. It's physical. It's neglect. The other kind of abuse is elderly abuse, which many of you might be exposed to, of listening to stories like this. Elderly abuse can be withholding, with adult children withholding resources from their parents. And there's a lot of that happens. This used to be 68 years old and older in California. Now it's 65 years and older. If I hear neglect or abuse of an elderly person, I need to report it. Adult dependent abuse, which means somebody that is dependent on another adult. For example, someone perhaps with Down syndrome or that's in a wheelchair. And it's about a threat to harm self or others. We look for a voluntary psychiatric evaluation. They really think you need to be evaluated. It's a 72-hour hold to take your blood and to look at what's happening in your life situation to see how you might be healed. And the involuntary evaluation is called a 5150 out here. The problem with that, if it's involuntary, to send somebody to a psychiatric evaluation, we don't have very many PET teams out here in Los Angeles, which is a psychiatric treatment team, no? But a lot of times it's the officers on the street that make that decision. So I'm going to be very reluctant to call the police with a 22-year-old who just got out of the academy that has a power to violate somebody to a psychiatric evaluation. I want to be present and I want to give my assessment. George, do you think this is okay what I'm doing? Father George?
I do. One person, though, suggested that I had a question about going back to boundaries and when they're violated. What do you
speak
do?
up, Father George?
One person had a question about boundary violations. What can you do to repair or heal them after they've happened?
Well, I think it depends on what happened.
Yeah.
I'll give you a very honest example. Years and years ago, as a young priest, there was a woman that was participating in our ministry where I was, and I really thought we were good friends. And one day I said, I love you I was meaning as a friend. It was being interpreted that I loved her in a romantic way and that I might leave the priesthood. That got me in terrible trouble, and I learned my lesson. I got right into therapy, and I started to learn how to check out the relationship when it becomes broken. At least I couldn't heal that one right away, but I certainly have come to a greater sense of consciousness in my other relationships. And I don't say things easily, but I check out what's being said. So I think it really, when I present this to our workers, they go, oh crap, I got a lot of forgiveness to ask, or I have a lot to change in my behavior. A lot of times we can't heal the brokenness like that little doll on the street, but we can adjust our behaviors and our decisions in the present. Does somebody have to go to jail because they touched somebody inappropriately if they just didn't touch that person? Again, the perception is the one that gets us in trouble in all the states. And sadly to say, not so much in Mexico and other Latin American countries, because they don't have the same reporting structure that we do. I don't know if that helps, Father George, but I mean, it's the best that I can do.
That's good. Also, as you were talking about earlier, issues of reporting and mandatory reporting, how about suspicion of trafficking? That's what the person asks, knowing who to report to and when it's appropriate.
We have it right down the street from where I live on Figueroa. All these young women are being trafficked. Now in California, the law has changed. If a young woman is arrested for prostitution under the age of 18, she's treated as a victim, not as a perpetrator. And so there's a whole realm of interventions that happen with that young woman. I believe we are mandated to report that. There's anonymous numbers that happen probably in all of our jurisdictions, that here in Los Angeles with the Los Angeles Police Department, we can call 911, or we can call the police and not give our names, or give our names. No, but I think it's important that we report it. And 911 is the better place than ever. Again, the mark of this is about reasonable suspicion. I'm not sure what's happening, but I reasonably suspect that there's trafficking or abuse going on. No? Now, with somebody that's an adult, a woman, or a perpetrator, a male that's using a prostitute, I mean, that's a very difficult one. It's illegal, but that has to go with vice. I mean, if I report it, that probably won't happen unless there's a whole mass of prostitution happening on a particular street, which happens here. We have like 20 officers that are assigned to vice. And I know many of them. So I think getting to know our local police department is very important, so we can have a dialogue and share our own relational power with them. Does that help, do you think?
Yeah, Yeah. And going back to reporting threats of harm to self or others, I think it's important to remember too, if you're talking with somebody and you suspect that they're thinking about suicide, it's important to ask them point blank, are you thinking about hurting yourself? That because chances are they're not going to lie about it; they're going to tell you. But don't assume. Don't assume. Um,
Thank you, Father George. I absolutely agree. We don't want to be playing games with people's lives. And so there's an assessment that's very easy for all of us. One is, do you have a history of attempting to take your life? That's one thing. Is there a history in your family? Another, do you have a means? And do you have a medium? In other words, if somebody says, I'm going to go home and shoot myself in the head right after school, that's absolute suspicion to report immediately, right? The problem is that we can't get a response immediately. That most police departments, in my experience, will wait till after something has occurred, a crime or self-harm has occurred. But at least to make that intentionality to intervene at that point. That's not rescuing. That really is intervention in saving a person's life.
and another person asks about when is it appropriate to tell the individual that you need to make a report about them.
That's also difficult. That's the problem and the difficulty that we have as therapists and intervention workers. That in group therapy, for example, I'll say, there might be some things that you don't want to talk about in this group because I'm a mandated reporter. And they go through, oh, you'll understand it's child abuse, anybody under 18, elderly abuse, emotional dependent abuse. So we're very clear about that I need to make. But here's a thing that I experienced too. There's one girl a couple of years ago, and she had been abused at 7 and 8 years old by one of her coaches. And she was about 14 at this point. She was really in a place of wondering about her sexual orientation. And she came to talk to me. And we told me about the abuse. I listened very intently. And I said, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to get the SOB. So I said, what if you make the report with me? And she did. And after she made the report, I don't know what the follow-up was, but she said, I finally got the son of a bitch, just in making the report with me. So if we believe in this empowerment rather than rescuing or helping, that I want somebody to know. I'm very concerned about you. And I told you early on that I need to report this for your safety, and for your healing. I think that's a good answer because we can empower one another by including them in the process. It doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be secret. With our intervention workers, it might be, I don't know what to do, homie. I got to report this stuff.
And I would like to remind our participants today, we have about 25 more minutes. So if there are questions you have, this would be a good time to put them in the chat.
And I'll go quickly. Many of our clients don't have words to put to their feelings. I discovered this work in my study, alexithymia. Anytime you hear thymia, it means a lack of. And alexi is about lexion, is about words. I don't have the words to put to my feelings. This, I believe, is our population's pathology. And pathology means the study of pain. Pathos in Latin really means to suffer. So it's the study of suffering. And so many people suffer because they don't have words to express what's happening. We have bodily sensations. We don't have the symbol systems, the words to put. And it's like a volcano erupting on the inside. Putting words to feelings. I think for all of us, this is probably then, apart from care, the number one skill that we bring to this is allowing people to talk about their internal world. Tell me how you feel. But how many people ask us, how do you feel? I know I don't get it all through the day. I think it's a great way to express care. I really want, how are you feeling today? In therapy, how are you feeling about your life? In confession and therapy, if somebody says, I don't know where to start, Father, I'll say, how are you feeling today? And then how are you feeling about life? And they usually take off. If we stay with the affect over the content, That means stay with feelings rather than the police want to know. I want to know everything that happened. You tell me what happened. I want to know what was occurring inside when it happened. And that's allowing the emotional intelligence or emotional skill to emerge, to name. So in group therapy a while back with different cultures and different neighborhoods in the same group, they would say, we can't even talk to each other outside of this therapy, Father Stan. We got to kill each other. But here it's like we share so much in common. And so at the end of every therapy session, at the end of any session, any time I'm with somebody, I'll ask, how did this feel to be together? What was this like? I remember one little girl the first week, she said, I feel like I was on blast. Now that's a term out here, no? He said, okay. The second time she came to therapy, she said, today I was chilling. Well, when somebody says something like that, I'll say, tell me what that means to you. What's another word for chilling? Because chilling for you might be different for chilling for me. And we have all these words that we just assume that we know what the meaning is, but to invite somebody to explore their inner world and the meaning they're putting onto words. The next week she said, this week I was tripping. Well, again, tripping for one person might be, there's this colloquial language all over our country and all over every country that we don't even know what people mean because we don't ask. The final time she said, today I feel effervescent. I said, where'd you get that word? She said, well, now that you're inviting us to put words to what we're feeling inside, I'm starting to find words in literature and in English, and it's helping me to describe what's happening inside. George, I think that's saving lives. That to find words. So like right now, Father George, I could say, what are you looking at? What are you looking at? Because I'm so intimidated by not knowing what you're looking, it can get you shot in the face. But when I start to develop these skills to find my own words for my inner emotions, then it's like, George, I see you looking at me right now and I'm feeling intimidated. I wonder what's happening. Could we talk about it? Very different than what are you looking at and shooting you in the face, which happens all the time out here. So I come to believe that all violence is about the repression of emotion that comes out projected into violent ways. I believe that all the donuts, and I don't know about you, but on all of our street corners, they're doing these circles all through the night. And people are being killed, crashing into each other and crashing into the mob. I believe that that's an emotional release of all of this repressed energy. It's unhealthy catharticism. And anything cathartic is the release of repressed emotional energy. And I believe that those of you that are working in lockup, you already do experience a lot of this. There's going to be things that are going to come out emotionally because you are the safe space, because they're listening to you. Most of the people that we serve experience deep developmental and intergenerational trauma. With trauma, there's an erased memory, as I've said, in the cells of our body, but it's still there. It's too painful to remember, so I repress it or I stuff it. It feels like chaos on the inside. I believe the best of pastoral care is simply, as I'm going to share with you, to create a safe space for another. We have a saying in therapy, we act out what we don't talk out. If I don't talk out my inner world, then it's going to come out in compulsion. Why did I eat the whole cake and not just one piece? Well, there's something unconscious going in there, a need that's being attempted to meet. But I think this happens with substance use, with sexual acting out, with all sorts of things. Exaggerated exercise, things that seem to be of value, anything that is that too much piece. There's something going on inside that I'm stuffing. Whenever somebody acts out of emotionality, it points to a deep inner pain needing to be attended to or healed. I'm finding myself preaching this, especially these weeks when now we're listening to the stories of healing and letting go and reconciliation. That if I don't talk out, I'm going to act it out. But anytime I act out emotionally, why did I just scream and Father George didn't? Because of my history, because of the way I was raised, because of my experience, because of my trauma that might be hidden unconscious in that 98% of the under part of the iceberg. So just observing our own emotional acting out is the first step. And then I think if I'm developing these emotional skills, then I'm going to be more passively effective because I'm going to listen to yours. There'll be more space on the inside for me simply to attend to you without having the answer. This is a whole family issue that I don't just act out on my own, but rather I'm acting out of something. In therapy, we call it the indicated patient. The young fellow that's getting high and acting out in gang involvement. Well, we're convinced that he's acting out the symptoms of the whole family. And so I want to know about the family. Just tell me about what happened when you were growing up. Talk to me. In therapy, we want the whole family present if possible. If there's family visits and you're the chaplain or the volunteer, I would just want to be present, just to listen, not to give any advice, not to tell people anything that's beyond confidentiality, but just tell me about your life because I care for your son or your husband. To focus on the emotion rather than on the content. Again, when there's altercations in our centers with fellas, the police come and they're going to go, tell me everything that happened. They separate out the fellas and the girls. Tell me everything that happened. Well, you're going to get 25 different versions. What I do after it comes down is I'll take some of the fellas aside one at a time and say, what were you feeling when that happened? That's where I think healing really happens, is if I start reflecting on my life. I have a colleague and with the girls, she'll say, what would you have done differently? And one of the principles is called the repetition compulsion. This again was Sigmund Freud that first used this term, that the past is repeated in the present. Then if I'm with somebody in confession or in therapy or just sitting with them, I don't have to say, let's go back to the beginning. I did that early on in my priesthood and I was sucked alive the next 3 hours. But rather, let's start with what's happening now in your life. Tell me how you feel today. And then if a person needs to, they'll go back to the past. And we usually do pretty quickly. But I start with the present and assume that there's patterns going to be repeated that I'm going to be able to listen to. And simply listening is bringing to consciousness from another's lips what they need. There's the area of erotic transference. I took 3 courses of this in my master and doctoral work. Why would I bring it up to ministers? Because it happens. And I want to share it with you. What is it? It's attraction is inevitable to people. Life is attracted to life. I imagine you have your favorites in your ministry, right? I'm drawn to certain people. Erotic transference doesn't necessarily mean sexual. It can get there, but the eros energy, that affect inside of me. You know, in Greek, there's at least 5 words for love or more. And eros is that affection kind of energy that if we don't experience it, then we're going to be cold monsters in this work, in this service. How does it manifest in our ministry? What are the intense emotional triggers that trigger certain affectivity in me? With our clients, with the people we serve, with our co-workers, with our supervisory staff, with guards. So it's about being attracted to another. And it can become dangerous when it's not conscious or when there's not appropriate boundaries. Like, if I'm going to tell you I love you, how are you going to take that? And my words have meaning, so I'm going to want to check it out with another person. Who triggers you emotionally? Who are you drawn to? What I believe absolutely is just to be conscious of that is everything. To be aware. Because I have certain favorites in my work and here at the parish, but I attempt that people don't know who my favorites are. And yes, I'll spend time with certain people that I feel safe with, but I'm not going to broadcast it everywhere either. This has a lot to do with appropriate boundaries, being aware of this. We have our coworkers that are starting to fall in love with each other and date. It usually disrupts the team. It usually affects the mission. And we have others, we have a couple of couples that are married and they're intervention workers, and no one else knows about it. They decide that they're not going to go public with this in the work. So to keep those clear professional boundaries. Unwelcome conduct is what this is really about. No? And so I think we have to be careful. A hug can be unwelcome conduct. When is touch appropriate? I did not initiate a touch. When I was a young pastor, I would do pastoral counseling appropriate in my office with the door closed and hug a person just afterwards. I would never ever do that again. I had to do doctoral work so I could learn clear boundaries and put a teaching like this together. But I would never, and we have a strict rule in therapy, you don't touch the patient because touch can be so volatile. So if someone asks me, and I have women all the time will say, "Oh, Father Stan, this was so wonderful. Can I give you a hug?" I'll say, what did I just do for the past hour? I've been giving you an emotional embrace, all this time embracing everything that's painful in your life. So I believe listening is the greatest gift that we can give to another. Creating safe spaces. How do you feel right now? I believe that projects care for another. The greatest gift we can give. I don't have the answer. And if I think I have advice to you, that's my own ego aggrandizement. I think that I'm important, that I think I know what you need. I will never know what another person needs. In therapy and as a priest, I don't tell people what to do. I explore with them. Listening. After lots of time, like I was mentioning about my colleague, Lakia, she would say, what would you have done differently when there was some altercation or some mistake? What would I do differently in terms of boundary violations? I learned from my therapeutic experience to check out the emotion of the people I'm dealing with, the ones I feel close with. And I'll do this in therapy, ask 5 times, how does this feel? Now, how does it feel? It's almost as if it's a measure for some healing that might be happening. Oh, and what's a word that portrays how you feel right now? I feel relief. I think that's huge. So we're almost finished with my part. What about aftercare? To whom do you refer? I believe one of the most important things that we do is termination. And yet in our cultures, we don't terminate well. In the therapy world, we're talking about termination a few weeks into the process of therapy. That who else could you talk to like this? I'm constantly inviting people to expand their network of trust. If there's anyone, is there a teacher? Is there someone in your life? Not imposing, but just planting that seed. I'm not the only person here in your world. I don't have to be. What about you? Who do you refer yourself to? Is there somebody you can talk about your feelings with? Many of us men are not good with our emotions. We are never taught it's okay to feel, to cry, to hurt. Oh, don't be a baby, Stan. But to talk about how I feel inside is so important. I have a spiritual guide I see once a month. I have a therapist I see once a month because of all the stuff that I carry. And I have 2 psychological colleagues that I can check in with each month. So all of these networks of people that I can just vomit out to, and it creates more space inside of me. But I see many of our chaplains, they go home isolated, and then I'm acting out of the pain of what they've been listening to all day. We have intervention workers that'll just go stop at a park before they go home, or the beach is only about 20 minutes from us. Some will even take a ride to the beach just to breathe a little bit and to call somebody that they can just to debrief with. If not, we're going to live like this. And I see so many people, priests and ministers, that live all bound up inside. You know, the word mercy, misericordia in Spanish, really has some Hebrew roots, which mean to unbind and set free. Every time I celebrate Mass and we pray for God's mercy, I'm saying, where do I need to be unbound, Lord, and set free? How might I be an instrument of unbinding and setting free simply by loving and caring and listening? Here's some practical challenges. This might not apply to you, but the team asked me to include them anyway, okay? One is, are you a part of a team? Because we need to depend on one another, I believe. My gifts are not your gifts. No? And my growing edges are your gifts. So if we have a team approach to this, and yet so many of our chaplains are isolated, especially out here in the rural parts of California, Unacceptable activities in my world, okay? And if this applies to yours, might be helpful. Things in our world, as Savea might say, should result in disciplinary action, and even including termination or lawsuits, even for priests and chaplains, and we know that too well. Do not act like a buddy. Hey dog, hey homie, hey fool. I don't use gang names. I use baptismal names, or the names that were given to people. We've had case managers and intervention workers going to parties where there was drive-bys that happened, and they were a part of having to be subpoenaed. And we never want to be subpoenaed out here. It ruins our license to operate. I was accosted my first month here at St. Raphael in this very difficult neighborhood. Shots went off at 12:30 at night just across our wall at a smoke shop. And I know the owner, he's the OG of this area. 7 fellas jumped the fence. And I go out with my little golden retriever, Maggie, or Noah, and one of the fellas comes up to me. He puts the gun right in my throat. I said, "You gonna shoot me?" He said, "No, man, we're just scared." I said, "Disperse them because SWAT is right outside." They all ran off. It was 4 hours later that I was with the captain and the sergeant of 77th Division here that they found the guys. Several here in the area of the church and school, and 2 on the street. The word got out that I didn't report what happened to me. And the word got out through that whole sentencing process that this was going to be a safe space because I didn't snitch. I didn't tell them what happened to me. I think it was an innate that I wouldn't do that. But I think we have to be careful about what we say and who we say it to. Do not share personal information. This is a big deal. Phone, email, taking them home with you. All of these other accesses to social media. You know what we say today is social media is not our friend. We can get people killed in 2 minutes because of paybacks, because of social mediums. We had this thing 2 years ago. It was called 100 Days, 100 Lives. And it was propaganda that got out there that some set out here, some gang was going to take 100 lives in 100 days. It threw a panic in the police department and also to our intervention workers and to the community because it was posted. After several months, it was determined that a little girl, 15 years old, put that post out on social media. And it caused a whole environmental and communal disruption because we have enough paybacks that are going on here. So this stuff is not our friend. I don't email anybody that's in my work except for our leaders. Do not give advice. Giving advice can be unethical and illegal. I don't know what you need. Humiliate people, and it can be subtle. We had a lot of humiliation going on in our work here when we had our schools, that the dean of the school would shame people, students, right in the hallway. You little gang banger. I mean, we have to be careful how we treat one another. We don't want to challenge or test the people that we serve. We do not want to make promises we can't keep, as I mentioned before. We do not express our personal feelings about others in front of the people that we serve. It could be verbally or by our body language. And I've seen an awful lot of aggravation happen between residents and staff and guards because of people that we're visiting. Triangulation with guards and staff. You know, we could be tainted by the stories that we hear, and I believe that our call is as much to the guards and staff as it is to the residents or those that we serve, because they need to be served also. Our counselors, many of them have, in our juvenile halls out here, have master's degree, and they've all been tainted because of the harshness of the system that has taught them more to be punitive than to be healing. We do not. Coming to an end, Father George. Gossip. And this is a big deal. When I'm feeling insecure, I might say something inadvertent about someone. And finally, not forget that our families and clients have special needs. In other words, I left a $100 bill on my desk one day. It was gone by the very guys that I trusted the most. When I talk about special needs, They might not share the ethics that we share. That we've had several teachers that have left their keys on their desk, and fellows went for joy rides. We want to be careful and be aware. This is the final. Not forget that there's so many wonderful things and rare things unique about us, our clients, our residents, the people that we serve, and ourselves.
Thank you, Father Stan. And you can see this material is so critically important to our work, as whether we're chaplains, whether we're volunteers, whether we're working with people inside the institutions or people who've been released. And one of the missions of the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition is to provide networking and support for you who are volunteers and ministers. And if you go to our website, you'll find all kinds of other webinars and also our foundational training that addresses many of the issues that Father Stan brought up today. So it's critically important that we be aware of this before we go into the institution, or if you're already in, it's never too late to learn. And it's better you learn from other people's mistakes than from your own mistakes as well. That's what I always tell my students. This information is really applicable to anyone who is entering the prison. So if you're going in as a volunteer 1 day a week, this is still important, critically important information that you be aware of. And whether you're working with men or with women, or whether even if you're working with the staff, to have this information in your toolkit is critical. And also, maybe above all, know when to refer. Remember, most of you going into the prisons as jail ministers, if some volunteers are paid, are not therapists, you're not social workers, you're not psychologists, and you're not there to do therapy. But it's important that you realize there are people there who can help with that, and you need to refer the people that you're encountering to the appropriate level of care that they need. So having said that, I just want to thank you and thank Father Stan for offering this really important information to us today.
Gracias.
Thank you all.